Yo, what is going on, everyone? My name is Nick, or the Notorious Fantasy, and in today's video, we're going to be going over my top 32 ranked running backs for week number 3 of the 2022 fantasy football season. But before we could get into things, I would like to ask that if you guys are new to the channel and you do end up enjoying today's video, that you please make sure to hit that subscribe button down below. And while you're down there, whether you are new to the channel or not, please make sure that you do leave a like on today's video. It would help me out a ton. And if you do want to follow me on Twitter, please do so at Notorious FNTSY. I would also like to ask that if you guys do have any questions about week number 3, it doesn't even have to be around the running back position. It could be about wide receivers, quarterback, tight ends, maybe even a trade question. Please make sure that you ask it down below in the comment section. I love talking to you guys down there. So without further ado, let's get into today's video. We begin with running backs 1 through 8, headlined by Jonathan Taylor of the Indianapolis Colts, facing off against the Kansas City Chiefs this week on Sunday at home in Indianapolis. Now, last week, they go up against the Jacksonville Jaguars in Jacksonville, and on paper, before the game, you would have thought that Jonathan Taylor was going to rip the Jacksonville Jaguars a metaphorical new asshole. You would have expected that the Indianapolis Colts would take the Jaguars to Pound Town, that the Indianapolis Colts would score 30-plus points, that this would be an extremely easy victory, even without Michael Pittman. But then you actually watch the game on Sunday, and the Indianapolis Colts came out flat. The Indianapolis Colts came out flat, and they stayed flat all game long because they scored a grand total of, drumroll please, 0 fucking points. They didn't score a single point in that game. Thus, Jonathan Taylor struggled mightily. He had 9 carries for 54 yards, which if he got like 20 carries, he probably would have had a decent game, but only 9 carries because they were down so bad. 54 yards, 1 target, 1 reception, 9 receiving yards, 7 half PPR fantasy points, and he was the running back 33 at the end of the week in half PPR in what might be the easiest matchup imaginable for a running back up against Jacksonville. This motherfucker finishes as the running back 33 in half PPR. Now, I'm not going to panic in week number 3 up against the Chiefs. Am I nervous that the Indianapolis Colts are going to get rolled up like a blunt and smoked in this game? Definitely. But I still think Jonathan Taylor is going to be involved. It appears, based upon what I have read, that Michael Pittman Jr. will be good to go in this game, and I think that helps the offense out a ton. So up against the Kansas City Chiefs, I imagine Jonathan Taylor gets back on the saddle and finishes as a top 3 running back on the week. Right now, I have him ranked as my RB number 1. At number 2, we have Dalvin Cook of the Minnesota Vikings going up against the Detroit Lions at home in Minnesota. Now, week number 2 up against the Eagles, that was a game that I envisioned, and a lot of people envisioned, as a very exciting game. Now, the game was exciting in the first half because the Philadelphia Eagles were just unloading into the Minnesota Vikings. It was fun, and then the second half, Kirk Cousins gave us vintage primetime Kirk Cousins, and the guy was just throwing the ball to Darius Slay all the time. It was embarrassing to see. So Dalvin Cook in that game didn't do very well. 6 rushes, not a lot of opportunities because they were getting beat down the whole game. 17 rushes, 6 targets, 4 receptions, 19 receiving yards, 6 fantasy points in half PPR, and he was the running back 44 in half PPR at the end of the week. In week number 1, he saw a lot of volume. 20 rushes, 90 rushing yards, 5 targets, 3 receptions, 18 receiving yards, 12 fantasy points, running back 20. He got a lot of volume, but he didn't necessarily do anything crazy with it. In this matchup up against the Detroit Lions, I like to call this a rock'em sock'em robots matchup, meaning that these are just 2 teams hunting for the head. 2 teams beating the ever-living shit out of each other back to back. They just keep punching each other. A very high point total, in my opinion. Thus, I think Dalvin Cook will have a good game. If Dalvin Cook struggles again, I'm going to start to get worried. But I'm not overreacting to week 2. I'm not overreacting to week number 1 because we saw the volume. This matchup looks great on paper. I expect Dalvin Cook to have a pretty solid game, and he is my running back number 2 right now. At number 3, we have CMC, Christian McCaffrey, running back of the Panthers, going up against the New Orleans Saints this week at home in Carolina. Week number 2, up against the Giants, Christian McCaffrey finishes as the running back 6.5 PPR, but I want to make it known that this was a, you know, when people in basketball, when they say, oh, that COVID ring, remember when the Lakers won the Mickey Mouse championship? This was a Mickey Mouse top 6 finish at running back because this man only scored 15 half PPR points and was a top 6 running back in fantasy football because the running back scoring in week number 2 was at an all-time low. In week number 1, McCaffrey scored 14 half PPR points and was the running back 18. He only scored one more fantasy point in week 2 and moved up 12 spots at the running back position. He looked better in week 2, I agree. This matchup, though, up against the Saints is definitely iffy. We saw Tampa Bay Buccaneers offense struggle against that defense. I think Christian McCaffrey gets it done just because of how talented he is. But I am really, if I'm Matt Rule, I am incredibly worried that my ass is going to get fired if I keep losing these games. I think Frank Reich with Jonathan Taylor is in a very similar spot. Next up, we move to RB number 4, DeAndre Swift of the Detroit Lions facing off up against the Minnesota Vikings in Minnesota. Now, I already talked about this game, and I believe this is going to be a rock'em sock'em affair here. This is going to be an incredibly high-scoring game. Now, going into last week, there were reports that, DeAndre Swift isn't going to see a full workload because of the fact that he's banged up. They don't want to chance things. I tell everyone, keep firing up DeAndre Swift. Play DeAndre Swift. It doesn't fucking matter if this guy's on a peg leg up against the Washington Commanders. He's going to go absolutely crazy. Now, he only gets 5 rushes, 56 yards, 5 targets, 2 receptions, 31 receiving yards. He scores a touchdown, 16 fantasy points, running back number 4. Now, definitely a downturn compared to what he got in week number 1 up against the Philadelphia Eagles, where he scored 25 half PPR points. But I think he's in for a bounce back spot here, if you even want to call it that, up against the Minnesota Vikings. I love how this offense looks with Jared Goff. I know Jared Goff isn't the most ideal quarterback to have on your team on earth, but Jared Goff's looking pretty good. Dan Campbell is leading this team, and DeAndre Swift looks chef's kiss, magnifique. And yes, I'm fully aware that there's going to be games where Jamal with 2 A's Williams comes in and vultures a touchdown from DeAndre Swift, but there's a lot of running backs like that have that situation in the NFL, so I think DeAndre Swift will be just fine. Again, he's a top 5 running back for me. Closing out the top 5, we got Joe Mixon of the Cincinnati Bengals going up against the Jets in MetLife. 2 weeks in a row of a very solid carry volume for Joe Mixon. Week 1 up against the Steelers, 27 carries in a game where they were getting the shit beat out of them early on. Week 2 up against Dallas, 19 rushing attempts. Now, the offensive line in Cincinnati has been very, I wouldn't even say so-so, because they've been incredibly bad. Now, realistically, maybe it's because you're putting a bunch of new guys together and they need time to gel. Maybe that gelling doesn't happen in week number 3 up against the Jets, and it takes all the way to maybe week 6, week 7, week 8. But this offensive line is actually better than last year's offensive line. It's just that right now, nothing is working. The offensive line is basically like a turnstile right now, allowing Joe Shiesty to get absolutely rocked. I brought up this stat in one of yesterday's videos that Najee Harris actually has less rushing yards than the yards that Joe Burrow has been sacked backwards. Because Joe Burrow is getting lit up like a fucking Christmas tree. Up against the Jets, though, I think he has a bounce-back game. He's very reliable every single week, that being Joe Mixon, even when the Bengals aren't doing too hot. And again, they're 0-2 right now. They certainly aren't going to lose to the Jumbo Jets like they did last year. Next up, we move to RB number 6, Saquon Barkley of the New York Football Giants, going up against the Dallas Cowboys on Monday Night Football. In week number 1, Saquon Barkley wears the crown, 30 fantasy points, RB number 1 at the end of the week. In week number 2, he actually sees more rushes, less targets, less receptions, scores 10 fantasy points, finishes as the RB 17. Again, in week number 2, the running back scoring was at an all-time fucking low. The wide receivers reigned supreme in week number 2. The volume's going to be there. I understand the Dallas Cowboys defense is pretty decent, so maybe you're a little bit worried about Barkley, but ranking him anywhere outside of the top 10 to me is definitely crazy, and I'm very excited to fire him up this week as my RB number 6. At number 7, we got a game tonight between such an exciting matchup of 9-inch Nicholas Chubb and the Cleveland Browns facing toe-to-toe up against the Pittsburgh Steelers, and the total on this game, the spread, the over-under, is 38.5. And that's not the spread. I understand the over-under total is 38.5. That is so bad. This game is going to have you knocked out bad by this fucking, once it hits halftime, you're going to fall asleep. This game is a certified snooze fest. But even though it's going to be a snooze fest, 9-inch Nicholas Chubb is going to get the rock. The game plan here is going to be to run the ball gently down the stream. Nicholas Chubb last week, 3 fucking tugs, 3 touchdowns in 1 week. Sounds like Robert Kraft. So I'm pretty excited about Nick Chubb in this matchup up against the Pittsburgh Steelers. I know their defense is pretty decent, but without TJ Watt, they are not as good. And again, this is going to be an incredibly low-scoring, run-heavy game. So I'm all in favor of Nick Chubb having a huge week. At number 8, we have Austin Eckler. Now, prior to the final 5 minutes of the game, things were looking bad for Austin Eckler, or I guess I would say the fourth quarter, because early on, it was like they're on the goal line. Knock, 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 knock. They're knocking on the door. Who's getting the ball? Sony Michel. Where's Austin Eckler? He got 14 rushes, 39 rushing yards, though he was saved by the 10 targets, 9 receptions, 55 yards at the end of the game, finishing as a top 10 running back. Now, I do not believe that the LA Chargers are going to choke like the Indianapolis Colts did up against the Jaguars. I expect this team to beat the ever-living shit out of the Jacksonville Jaguars, even when Justin Herbert, the pervert, has like half a rib left. It's crazy that he's even going to play in this game, but they don't even need him at full strength. They are going to eviscerate the Jacksonville Jaguars. I expect Eckler to bounce back. I am, though, somewhat nervous about Austin Eckler because, to be honest with you, it doesn't seem at all that he is in the same situation as he was in last year. It really does seem like this year they really want to utilize a second running back and not just give a crazy workload to Austin Eckler, a.k.a. Mr. Clean. Next up, we move to running backs 9 through 16, headlined by Javonte Williams of the Denver Broncos, going up against the 49ers this week at home in Denver on Sunday Night Football. Now, current expert consensus rankings over on Fantasy Pros have Javonte Williams as running back 11, so I do have him ranked slightly higher. Now, my worries about Javonte Williams in the offseason were that Melvin Gordon is still there and he's going to see enough usage to derail Javonte Williams. Now, Melvin Gordon is still getting used, but that's not why Javonte Williams hasn't succeeded. Javonte Williams hasn't succeeded because the Denver Broncos, despite on paper having a great offense, having a great defense, Nathaniel Hackett is such a fucking stooge. He is such a dipshit that this Denver Broncos team is imploding on itself. They barely beat the Houston Texans. They get soaked week 1 by the Seattle Seahawks. Javonte Williams, they get into the red zone and they can't fucking score. It's like they have the answer to the test all the way up the field, and once they get into the red zone, Nathaniel Hackett forgets what he's doing. No idea what he's doing. It is embarrassing. Javonte Williams is so talented. You can see it every single week. And the reason why Javonte Williams was decent week 1 was because the motherfucker saw 12 targets in week 1 up against Seattle. Last week, only 4 targets. He did get an upgrade in terms of his rushing attempts, 15 rushing attempts when compared to 7 in week number 1. But I'm starting to get a little bit worried. This matchup definitely isn't ideal, but I also feel as though there's no way the Broncos continue to be this bad. I am trying my hardest not to overreact to the first 2 games, and I think if you do overreact to the first 2 games, you probably would have Javonte Williams ranked significantly lower. He was the RB22 in half PPR last week. My RB number 10 right now is Alvin Kamara of the New Orleans Saints going up against the Carolina Panthers this week in Carolina. Alvin Kamara returned to practice on Wednesday yesterday. So it appears that there's at least a decent chance that Alvin Kamara plays on Sunday up against the Panthers. Again, am I locking that in? No. If Kamara does not play, you need a safety valve. That safety valve is Mr. Mock Ingram, who could slot in up against the Panthers defense as a potential top 18-ish running back. So I'm just telling you right now, personally right now, based upon what I have read about Alvin Kamara, I think he's going to suit up and play this week for week number 3. Now, earlier, once we heard about the injury, there's reports that he might not only miss week 3, but also miss week 4, which has me a little bit nervous. So again, I'm not telling you lock in Alvin Kamara and don't check your lineup on Sunday. You need to make sure you are very on top of things. If you have Alvin Kamara on Sunday, make sure you check out the stream that's on this channel as well as on the Stokastic Fantasy Football channel, because I talk about all the players that are inactive, the players that are active. So if Alvin Kamara is inactive, you obviously don't want the motherfucker in your lineup, but assuming that he plays. Week number 1 up against Atlanta, that's such an easy matchup, and he doesn't do good at all. He was the running back number 47, but that was just an odd game as a whole for the New Orleans Saints. I think Alvin Kamara bounces back in a big way when he's healthy. Again, assuming that is this week. At number 11, we got Uncle Leonard Fournette of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers facing off up against the Green Bay Packers on Sunday at 4:25 Eastern Standard Time. Lenny's gotten the volume, he just hasn't found the end zone. 0 touchdowns through 2 weeks. He has had over 40 rushes total, so he's had 21 rushes, 24 rushes. He had over 100 rushing yards in week number 1. Week 2 up against New Orleans, things were a little bit tougher for Uncle Lenny, but Uncle Lenny went on Twitter, Leonard Fournette, and he tweeted out, "Fantasy owners, don't worry. I've got your back. I know I haven't scored. The touchdowns are coming. Don't drop me." I think is what he said. No one was going to drop you, Leonard Fournette. Everyone was going to start you anyways, even if you didn't say anything. But you know what? Leonard Fournette knows he cares about us, the fantasy football players. So I like Leonard Fournette a ton up against the Green Bay Packers. They really don't have many options to throw the ball to because of so many injuries, which makes me think that Leonard Fournette might get like 8 or 9 targets potentially in this game. Again, don't pencil that in. That's definitely pretty high, but it is possible with how many injuries the Tampa Bay Buccaneers have. At number 12, we have Mr. Aaron Jones of the Green Bay Packers, the other running back in this game, until we talk about the other running back in this game, which is Dillon, up against the Buccaneers. Week number 2 up against the Chicago Bears, 15 carries, 132 rushes, 3 targets, 3 receptions, 38 receiving yards, not 1, but 2 touchdowns, RB2 at the end of the week, 31 half PPR fantasy football points. Week number 1, we see that it's an Dillon week up against the Minnesota Vikings. Week 2, it was clearly the Aaron Jones week. Now, on the Pat McAfee show that Aaron Rodgers goes on, Aaron Rodgers says that we want to give the ball to 28 and 33. 28's A.J. Dillon, 33 is Aaron Jones. And he said in a perfect world, in the ideal world in his brain, they get a combined 30 touches. So 15 and 15 ideally is what Aaron Rodgers wants for the two guys. But he also stated that some weeks, the game plan is just going to go to Jones. Other week, the game plan is just going to go to Dillon. So that makes them a bit risky every single week, but they both have a shit ton of upside. I am still in the standpoint and still in the belief point that I believe that Aaron Jones is the guy. He is the better running back of the two in the backfield. And when I say that, I'm not trying to demean A.J. Dillon because I think he's a talented player. All I'm saying is that Aaron Jones is better in my mind. Before we move on into running back 13 here, I would like to give you guys a quick word from our friends and our sponsor of today's video. They've been on your screen the whole entire video. Underdog Fantasy. Are your best ball teams already cooked? Well, head on over to Underdog Fantasy to resurrect them with their brand new Week 6 through 17 best ball tournament. The entry fee is only $10 with $500,000 in total prizes and $100,000 going to first place. All you got to do is draft your team and that's it. You don't have to worry about the waiver wire, making trades, or in-season management because Underdog will automatically give you the best score at the end of each week of the season. Underdog also features daily and best ball contests for MLB, NBA, PGA, as well as NHL, so you can get into action all year long. You don't just have to play during the NFL season. All you gotta do is click on the link down below in the video description or use promo code Stokastic to get a first match deposit bonus of up to $100 with Underdog. So you deposit $100, they will give you an additional $100. So if you're talking about the Best Ball Resurrection Tournament, that is 10 free entries into that. I love drafting. The worst part of the season for fantasy football is that you can't draft anymore. But guess what? On Underdog Fantasy, you can. So make sure you guys do go ahead and check that out. Back on into things, my RB13, Clyde EdwardsHelaire. I was one of the bigger Clyde EdwardsHelaire fans this offseason. I was banging the drum relentlessly for the guy, and the guy has performed in a big way like Lizzo does. So 2 weeks in a row of solid production. RB number 6 in week number 1 up against the Cardinals. RB number 10 in week number 2 up against the Chargers. Obviously, it's not just a Clyde EdwardsHelaire monarchy in this backfield. They still want to use other running backs. You're going to see Pacheco, you're going to see McKinnon, but at the end of the day, Clyde EdwardsHelaire is still the number 1 guy. He catches a decent amount of passes, 3 targets in week 1, 4 targets in week number 2. Up against the Indianapolis Colts, I expect to see a ton of Clyde EdwardsHelaire. Next up, we move to RB number 14, and I've eaten crow on Antonio Gibson, at least until Brian Robinson returns, because Antonio Gibson has looked pretty good. His numbers in the rushing total in week number 2 weren't the best. 14 rushes, 28 yards. That's 2 yards per carry for the people at home. 4 targets, 2 receptions, 13 receiving yards, but he scored. He scored to save his day. 11 fantasy points in half PPR, running back number 15. In week number 1 up against the Jaguars, he looked significantly better. This is another one of those matchups. We got the Commanders versus the Eagles that I believe will be a very high-scoring back-and-forth affair. And not every time it's a high-scoring back-and-forth affair is great for a running back, but Antonio Gibson obviously has some solid pass-catching prowess to him, so I think he'll have a pretty solid performance here up against the Eagles. I don't really think he's going to be a top 5 back, but he certainly could be closer than or to number 12. He's running back 14, obviously. I don't have him ranked incredibly low or incredibly high. I think he's a decent start this week. Next up, we move to David Montgomery of the Chicago Bears going up against the Houston Texans at home in Chicago. 15 rushes last week up against Green Bay, 122 yards, 2 targets, 2 receptions, 14 receiving yards, 15 fantasy points, RB number 8. Now, for some fucking reason, they go from Matt Nagy, who is a certified stooge, a grade A fucking dumbass, to Matt Eberflus, who also appears to be an idiot, because all this team wants to do is play football like it's 1950. All they want to do is run the ball. They're playing like they're fucking Air Force or Army in college football. They might as well start utilizing the triple option out there because of how little they throw the ball. I am pretty sure, now don't quote me on this, I'm pretty sure that Justin Fields has thrown the 33rd most amount of balls. He is the 33rd most amount of attempts passing the ball in the NFL. There's only 32 fucking starting quarterbacks in the NFL, and this motherfucker is number 33. They just keep wanting to run the ball. David Montgomery isn't this crazy player, but he's going to keep getting volume. They're playing the Texans, which is a very easy matchup, so David Montgomery cracks the top 15 this week. I don't know what they're doing. I really don't know what they're doing. Does the team just not believe that Justin Fields is the guy? That's what it's starting to feel like. Closing in the top 16, we got Derrick Henry of the Tennessee Titans, de Les Titans. 2 weeks in a row where Derrick Henry takes a colossal shit directly on your chest. 8 fantasy points in half PPR week 1. Week number 2 up against the Bills, 9 fantasy points. Now I understand, but Nick, the Bills defense is just so good, and they benched Derrick Henry because Tannehill fucked them over. I understand, right? They had an awful game, but in week 1 against the Giants, he didn't do good either. He scored less fantasy points in week 1 against the Giants. So look, I'm not starting to be in full-on panic. Not dropping Derrick Henry. I'm not trading Derrick Henry for 4 bites of a fucking cheese doodle, but I am starting to worry a little bit. I'm not in full-on panic. I'm not in tear everything down, but I'm in, is this Titans team not the Titans of the past? Is Derrick Henry still Derrick Henry? Now, I think he still is. I really do, but I am concerned. So I definitely want to start Derrick Henry this week, but my confidence, the pendulum has swung to an all-time low for Derrick Henry. Now we move to running backs 17 through 24. Number 17 is James Conner. Just like Alvin Kamara, based upon what I have read, James Conner seems like he's going to be GTG, which means good to go in week numero 3. Now again, make sure you're paying attention on Sunday. Make sure you're paying attention, because if it turns out that James Conner's inactive, then you don't want to put a fucking goose egg in your lineup. Week 2, prior to him getting hurt up against the Raiders, he wasn't playing all too well, but neither was the whole Arizona Cardinals team. 7 rushes, 25 rushing yards, 4 targets, 2 receptions, 26 yards, 6 fantasy points. Darrell Williams ended up scoring in that game. They also have Eno Benjamin, who they could use, so if Conner is out, it is going to be a kind of confusing scenario for which running back you want to be starting. I know up against the LA Rams, this is going to be a tough matchup. The Rams defense is definitely much better than they showed when they got absolutely skull-fucked by the Buffalo Bills. So I do believe in week number 3, if James Conner plays, you want to be starting him. He's definitely a top 20 back. At number 18, we have Cordarrelle Patterson, running back of the Atlanta Falcons, facing up against the Seattle Seahawks this week in Seattle. Now, week number 1, Cordarrelle Patterson was on a heater. Cordarrelle Patterson was on fucking fire, NBA Jam style. In week number 2, he cooled off. He was ice cold, RB51. But he went from the Saints defense, which I think is pretty tough, to the Rams defense. That's really good. But now he gets the Seattle Seahawks defense. This, realistically, could be Cordarrelle Patterson's best game. Patterson, ever since the Atlanta Falcons dug up his body out back and decided to feature him as a key piece in this offense, has been dominant. Now, again, I understand he has one bad week against the Rams, but that's not going to make me panic. We saw how good he was in week number 1. 22 carries, 120 rushing yards, 5 targets, 3 receptions, 16 receiving yards, a touchdown, 21 half PPR points, running back 4 at the end of week number 1, where a lot of running backs put up big numbers. Up against the Seattle Seahawks, I believe this is a big bounce back spot for Cordarrelle Patterson. I did have a tough time ranking him, though, because running back 19, 20, 21, 22, and 23, except for Josh Jacobs, running back 24. All of them, I believe, are very close in my brain, and I don't have a very definitive stand on all of them. I kind of would clump them into one group. If you asked me on Sunday, Nick, would you rather start James Robinson or Cordarrelle Patterson? Maybe on Sunday I'll tell you to start James Robinson because, again, how close they are in my brain. And speaking of James Robinson of the Jacksonville Jaguars, running back number 19 going up against the LA Chargers this week in LA. In week number 1, James Robinson comes out after getting fucking hurt at the end of last season, and it looks like nothing even changed. He's still the same guy that helped you win a fantasy league 2 years ago. That was pretty solid last year. He's the same guy. 19 fantasy points week 1, 15 fantasy points week 2, 2 back-to-back Michael Jordan 96, 97 top 10 performances. Travis Etienne is shaking. He's shaking. It came out after week 1 up against Washington that he was nervous. He was spooked to catch the ball. Etienne is looking like an all-time bust. Now, I know, Nick, it's only week 3. I know, for some players, yeah, I'll give them that credit. But in weeks 1 and 2, Robinson has clearly been the better back. Last week, I gave Etienne the benefit of the doubt. I said, you know what? Let's go with one last ride. One last hoorah for Travis Etienne. And if Etienne screws me over, if Etienne bends me over a table and metaphorically fucks me in the ass with his fantasy football production, then guess what? I'm done with him. Friendship has been ended with Travis Etienne. My new best friend is James Robinson. I am so excited for James Robinson this week, even up against a tough Chargers defense. It is why he's not ranked higher, because honestly, I could see him being a top 10 back, but up against the Chargers defense, it will be a little bit more different, or not different, it'll be a little bit more difficult. At running back number 20, we move to Najee Harris of the Pittsburgh Steelers, going up against the Cleveland Browns. 2 straight weeks of performances. I know he gets hurt in week number 1, but week number 2, he comes back up against New England and is just all right. I mean, the biggest positive towards Harris is it does feel like Kissin' Titties Mitchell Trubisky wants to throw him the ball. So even if he has a so-so rushing game with like 13 carries, he gets like 45 yards, he can make up with that by just catching passes. 6 targets, 5 receptions, 40 receiving yards. Got 11 fantasy points in week number 2. Najee Harris is also starting to feel like we made a bad news Bears decision when we drafted this guy. Again, it's only week 3, so I'm not full-on panicking, and maybe things will get better when Kenneth Pickett ends up being the starting quarterback of the team. Maybe that is true. Maybe just the Bengals defense, the New England defense, the Cleveland defense are tough. Then maybe at some point in the season he gets a better schedule. But his schedule does look concerning, aside from next week when he plays the Jumbo Jets, and that should be a great matchup for him. So I'm worried on Najee Harris. Again, we're not in full-on fucking trade Najee Harris for a broken condom, but we're starting to not feel as confident when we play him, and we have to lower our expectations. Running back 21, we get to A.J. Dillon of the Green Bay Packers going up against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Did you guys know that A.J. Dillon, I watched a whole video on this, I know it's not important at all, but A.J. Dillon actually collects cards, like NFL cards, and he personally gets people, like he has like Davante Adams cards that Davante Adams just signed directly on the card. So it's a unique like one-of-one card. He might have the most expensive NFL card collection because he's basically doesn't have to actually pack the good cards. He can just pack a regular Aaron Rodgers card and just have the motherfucker sign it. And that's worth a lot of money. I thought that was kind of interesting. Again, has nothing to do with fantasy football. Seems like A.J. Dillon's a pretty smart dude, though. I like A.J. Dillon a ton. Last week, 18 rushes, 61 rushing yards, 3 targets, 1 reception, 6 receiving yards, 7 fantasy points, RB31. He got the volume, just didn't score 2 touchdowns like the Sombrero King Ron Jones did. Again, every week, things are going to be different with Jones and Dillon. This week, could A.J. Dillon be like week 1 where he scores 18 fantasy points as RB10? Definitely. And then we could see Aaron Jones not have as good of a game. That is definitely possible. This week, though, I will bet more on the talent and lean with Aaron Jones, but I still think A.J. Dillon is a pretty talented player. At number 22, we have Kareem Hunt of the Cleveland Browns going up against the Pittsburgh Steelers. Again, I expect this to be a very run-heavy game. Kareem Hunt has back-to-back weeks with over 10 rushes. In week number 1, what the kicker was with Kareem Hunt is that he got extra points because he scored 2 touchdowns. Week 2 doesn't get as many touchdowns because he scores 0. So 0 touchdowns for Kareem Hunt. Doesn't have as big of a game, but he's still pretty reliable. He's going to see 2, 3, 4, 5 targets every game, get 10 plus carries, and be decent for your team. He's never really going to sink your team, but he has the upside to take your team over the top if he finds pay dirt at least once in the game. So I like Kareem Hunt a decent amount this week as my RB22. Again, I'm not overwhelmingly excited because there are game scripts where the Browns are down and they just start force-feeding the rock to Kareem Hunt. I don't think that's going to be the narrative in this game. And had the Jets have not gotten blown out early on, we would have seen more dump-offs to Kareem Hunt in week number 2. He only had 2 targets and 2 receptions. Next up, we move to RB number 23 with Jeff Wilson Jr. Tyrion Davis-Price going to be missing a decent amount of time. Elijah Mitchell is going to be missing a decent amount of time. So now it's officially Jeff Wilson season. Jeff Wilson season. S-Z-N. Jeff Wilson season. J-W-J season. 18 rushes, 84 rushing yards, 2 targets, 2 receptions, 19 receiving yards, 11 fantasy points, RB14 up against the Seahawks defense. This week he gets the Broncos, so I don't think he will be as effective, but he is still the clear number 1 back on a team that now doesn't have Trey Lance, so he has more opportunities to see carries because Trey Lance would have, quote-unquote, stolen the carries, which I wouldn't consider them to be stolen, but he was going to run the ball himself, and Jimmy Garoppolo is as good as a fucking statue in the pocket. So Jeff Wilson's going to get all the rushing volume. I think he's going to have a good game up against the Broncos. The defense does concern me a little bit, which is why I got him at RB23. And now is where things start to get incredibly dicey here at running back number 24 and beyond. 24, we got Josh Jacobs of the, turn your volume down, the Las Vegas Raiders going up against the Tennessee Titans in Tennessee. The battle of the clowns, the battle of the basement. 2 0-2 teams. Josh Jacobs, the reason why you draft him is because you know that while this is going to be an RBBC, a running back by committee, Jacobs is the most talented, and if they get on the goal line, realistically, they should use Jacobs, and there's a team that should be scoring a lot of points because they're the Raiders. They bring in Davante Adams, they got Derek Carr, they got Hunter Renfrow, they've got Darren Waller, they have, for some reason, I just had a fucking brain fart there and couldn't pronounce any of their names, but they have Adams, they have Carr, they have Renfrow, they have Waller, they have all of these players, so they should be able to move the ball effectively. Last week, Josh Jacobs, 10 carries for 69 yards. Very nice. I like. 1 target, 1 reception, 12 receiving yards. What I don't like, though, is his RB finishes. RB 35 and 25 in the last 2 weeks. Now, the reason why, again, I like Jacobs is because I think he can score. And I think there's going to be games where he scores 2 or 3 touchdowns. He's not the sexiest play. He never will be. But he does have the upside to be a top 12 back when he does end up scoring. Now we move to where, again, it's just looking down bad over here. RB25, Miles Sanders. Sanders is decent. RB11 and RB18 back-to-back weeks. He's not seeing as many targets as I would hope to see if I was someone who had Miles Sanders on my team. 3 targets in week 2, 2 targets in week 1. He is getting a decent amount of carries, though. 13 carries week 1, 17 carries in week number 2. He looks pretty solid. I expect a solid game out of him up against Washington, but they do have other running backs, and that is a bit of a red flag because the team will, I know Gainwell wasn't really involved in week 2, but they'll use Gainwell. They'll use Boston Scott. In week number 1 against Detroit, they all scored a fucking touchdown, so they're going to use multiple backs, and that does make me a little bit more nervous about Miles Sanders. 26, we got Darrell Henderson. He scores in week number 2, 10 rushes for 47 yards. Week 1, 13 rushes for 47 yards, but he had 5 targets and 5 receptions. Week 2, he had 0 targets, 0 receptions, but he did end up scoring to save his day. My excitement on Darrell Henderson has fallen off the edge of the earth like what Christopher Columbus believed would happen if he kept sailing, you know? It's scary. It is incredibly scary to start Darrell Henderson right now. Now, I have him listed as a start. I would start him, but just so you know, there's going to be a point this season, which I mentioned even last week, where Cam Akers takes back over. They clearly believe in Cam Akers. Cam Akers is going to see touches, and if you had Cam Akers ranked ahead of Darrell Henderson, Akers is running back 32. You see him on the screen here. Darrell Henderson 26. I wouldn't get into some argument with you. I know Darrell Henderson outscored Akers last week, but it seems like they want to give Akers the volume. So that's obviously concerning when you have Darrell Henderson. Next up, we got Ezekiel Elliott, and this pick just looks fucking bad. I don't think I ever once advocated for drafting Ezekiel Elliott, but people draft him, obviously. Like, it made sense, right? You could talk yourself into a scenario where Zeke was banged up last year. That's why he sucked. Dak is back. He's more healthy. He was more healthy, and obviously not right now. They got Lamb. Sure, Cooper's gone, but this is an offense that's going to put up numbers. The offense hasn't looked great. Now Zeke's getting the carries. He just needs to do something with them. 10 rushes week 1, 15 carries week 2. Not really getting many targets. Tony Pollard scored last week. He's been running back 48 and 45 in the last 2 weeks. Not great at all. Again, do I think that you should just panic and trade Zeke for nothing? No. But do I want to be starting Zeke weekly? Fuck no. Fuck no. Capital F-U-C-K. I'm incredibly nervous about Zeke and where he stands. The matchup against the Giants is nice. Expert consensus ranking on Fantasy Pros have him as running back 22. That seems extremely high. Incredibly high. Now, again, I think that he's going to be okay. But I just don't see him really being what he used to be. I think that Ezekiel Elliott, like Humpty Dumpty, has fallen off the wall. He's fallen off a cliff, and I'm not too sure we're going to be able to retrieve him. Running back 28, Damien Harris. While I talked in the offseason a lot about Harris versus Stevenson, Harris was initially getting drafted rounds ahead of Stevenson. Then, at least on Underdog, these sharper drafts where people are putting in money, the ADPs were getting closer and closer and closer until Stevenson eclipsed, jumped over, leapfrogged Mr. Damien Harris. And that appears to have been the wrong move because it seems like Harris is the guy. Week 1 up against Miami, the Dolphins' run defense looked a lot better than I previously thought they would. I'm a Dolphins fan. Our run defense for the last 2 years, not including this year, has been awful. The defense just parts like Moses parted the Red Sea, and then you'd see Damien Harris just, ka-chow, fucking Lightning McQueen, run a hole right through there. Run train right through the Dolphins. But this year, shit appears to be different. Week 2 up against Pittsburgh, Harris looks good, finishes as the RB5. The Baltimore run defense is okay. I watched that whole game up against the Dolphins last week. Definitely a much different offense, though, the Patriots compared to the Dolphins, right? The Patriots will put your ass to sleep. The Dolphins will come back down a zillion points. So the Patriots, they're going to be all right. Damien Harris is going to be all right. But again, this range is far from guys that I really want to be starting. RB29, we got Michael Carter, back-to-back weeks with over 5 targets. The team wants to continue to push for Michael Carter. Breece Hall eventually is going to take over. I just don't see it happening yet. I just really don't. Like, I understand he did good last week. He looks good. Breece Hall looks incredibly good. But the team hasn't committed to him. And until they do, I think I want to keep starting Carter because he has more receiving upside. 30, Damien Pierce. A lot of positivity out of Lovie Smith towards Damien Pierce. He's getting more and more touches. 11 rushes week 1, 15 in week 2 for 69 rushing yards. Very nice. I like 1 target in both games. 8 fantasy points, a step up. He doubled his fantasy point total from week number 1. Just keep on building, Damien Pierce. I know people are like, Nick, you told me to draft Damien Pierce. Damien Pierce is a fucking bust, you stupid motherfucker. Why is he? I drafted him like the 5th round. He's only getting like 4 or 5 points a game. You have to understand with these rookies, it takes time. With Breece Hall, it's taken time, and people aren't shitting themselves about Breece Hall. They're holding them on the bench, and they are like, okay, in a couple of weeks, I can start him. Do the same thing with Damien Pierce. The problem is that the hype train was too large, and I might have been a part of that. I was a big part of the hype train. I thought Damien Pierce would be useful week 1. Sure, we're going to have to wait a little bit more time, but eventually, Damien Pierce could be a guy that we're talking about as a top 12 back every single week, even on a not-so-hot Texans team, and I think Damien Pierce is going to continue to get more receiving work as well going forward. Next up, we move to RB number 31, Devin Singletary. Now, Devin Singletary has been incredibly effective thus far this season, 4.8 yards per attempt, looking great. But the problem is he's only seen 14 attempts through 2 games, 67 rushing yards total. The thing is, the Buffalo Bills, despite kicking the shit out of the Tennessee Titans, they don't run the ball. They just keep smearing the game down the throat of the team. If they beat the Dolphins, which is possible, if they kick the shit out of the Dolphins, it won't even matter because Devin Singletary won't get volume. And I really like Devin Singletary because he caught fire. He caught fire like that Hunger Games book towards the end of last season. And then it didn't roll into this season. Now, he's still the number 1 guy. I'm convinced of that. But he just has not been safe at all. And we haven't really seen the upside. He's just not very usable for fantasy football. RB32 Cam Akers. Again, Akers did see more touches than Darrell Henderson in week numero 2 up against Atlanta. 15 rushes, 44 rushing yards, 3 targets, 2 receptions, 18 receiving yards, 7 fantasy points. I think eventually things will click for Cam Akers, and he'll be the guy over Darrell Henderson. But right now, life on the line, death beam pointed at Earth from the fucking aliens. I want Darrell Henderson. I want Iguodala. You guys ever seen that video? That's a great video. You want Curry or Iguodala? I want Iguodala. So thank you guys all so much for watching today's video. If you ended up enjoying, make sure that you hit that subscribe button down below, as well as hitting that like button. It would help me out a ton. If you do want to follow me on Twitter, please do so at Notorious FNTSY. I love you guys all so much. I hope you have a great rest of your guys' day. And as always, good boy.